So we're going to move into section 4. Section 4 is the 7-step integration framework. Okay. So I'm just going to lay it out there. We've heard, this is where we essentially get to the heart of the training. The 7-step integration framework for combat veterans ministry. And I'm going to offer this in a document form as well, where you can download it. These steps are designed to implement sequentially, but they're also cyclical. Okay. So you'll return to earlier steps as your ministry grows to adopt more veterans and expand. Okay. I think that's the best way I can explain it. But we're really just going to go step by step in the instruction process. So step 1, personal preparation. Pastoral leaders must first self-educate. This is a crucial step in the process. Before you can effectively minister to a veteran, you need to educate yourself, right? If you're expected to train on any subject, you should educate yourself on that subject. So this isn't optional, it's foundational. This is where you establish the foundation for understanding what veterans are going through so we can best adapt to them. Okay? So, action items. Read some books. Okay? Learn basic military terminology and culture. I'm going to give you a couple examples of the books I was talking about. But basically, if you want to break it down, you can read Thank You for Your Service by David Finkel. Okay? Or What is It Like to Go to War by Carl Marlantes. Those are some examples. There's Tribe by Sebastian Junger. There's all kinds of, actually, I was just on a call a minute ago by a clinical psychologist and business partner, and he recommended I read Tribe as an example. Haven't read it yet myself. So that's a book that I'm going to read. So just understand there's some books out there. We'll give you links in the description below on how to get a hold of those, Amazon and different places. Learning basic military culture. I'll also provide as much links as we can to all these types of things so you can learn at no cost, right? We don't want to make it expensive. But, some of the things you can do is understand the rank structures. Enlisted versus officer. And then what's a warrant officer? I became a warrant officer later on in my career. What is that? That's a whole different, what the heck, right? So you can learn about the rank structure. You can learn about the different branches. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. I don't know. Coast Guard, I think, falls under Department of Homeland Security now, but now we have Space Force, right? And so each of these have the unique culture and understand where they're coming from. And then just familiarize yourself with common acronyms. MOS, Military Occupation Specialty. TDY, Temporary Duty Location, right? PCS, Permanent Change of Station. There's all these different acronyms and, that you can find online. Some are even inappropriate. So I'm going to just throw that out there. As you do your studies, you may come across some that sneak in there that are kind of inappropriate, but that's also part of the military culture, I'll be honest with you. And then understand deployment cycles and their impact on the families. Because understand, the veterans community involves their families. There's kind of this weird saying, if you will, that if I'm a captain in the Army and my wife, in her case, she served, but let's say she didn't serve, that she holds the same rank as me, right? That's how we're treated, because what I'm going through, she's going through. I would even argue sometimes even worse. She's being left behind for those deployment cycles or training cycles or whatever. Sometimes it's even harder on the spouse. And so that's another community that we need. These veterans walk in with their families, their children who felt abandoned for years because of deployments or whatever. So there's a lot of things we got to consider. So that's some of it. Then we also want to study the moral injury of combat trauma. Okay. So, we talked about reading some books. We talked about getting to understand the military culture a little bit. Then you want to study the moral injury and combat trauma. You could read the latest. You could read the latest research on PTSD and moral injury. Ton of information available on the VA website. Ton of information available if you just Google search. You can understand, that PTSD it's a wound. It's an actual wound, not a weakness. Learn the distinction between psychological trauma and spiritual moral injury. Look, I'm not a clinical expert. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychologist, none of those things, right? But it doesn't mean we can't read and understand what people are going through. Also, keep in mind that this is something combat veterans go through. PTSD is a very common thing. PTSD also exists outside of combat veterans. So this will help overall your ministry for people who need healing. A key resource is actually the Moral Injury Project at Syracuse University. So you can use that as a key resource for a lot of that information I just talked about. So we talked about understanding, reading some books, understanding the culture, getting the moral injury, combat trauma, educating yourself on that. The final thing you want to educate yourself on is examine your own theology of war and violence. This is now a look inward, a self-reflection. How do you personally reconcile Christian faith with military service? What's your position on the justness of war theology? Can you minister to someone whose experience is different from your theological position, for example? These are questions you must ask yourself and build a foundation upon. And then be prepared to hold a space for discussions and difficult questions. They're not going to come with difficult questions. Don't come with easy answers. So be ready for that. So why does this matter? Why do these things matter? Well, look, you got to set the foundation, right? Veterans can sense when someone's just unprepared or insincere. Your investment in understanding the world, it builds credibility and trust. And again, you don't really get to know the person until they trust you. I could tell you in the circle of veteran friends that I personally engage with often, every one of us has trust issues. Okay. We oftentimes were abandoned by many people who were supposed to be there for us. So on a very personal level, many in my circle also have trust issues with authority and government as a result of the things that we did and seen. So that's step one.